Is It Night or Day by Fern Chapman. Chapter 1. Nobody Told Me Anything. Germany, 1938. The first long train trip I ever took in Germany was my last. Now see that it was a funeral procession. The maneuvers traveling with me were my father, my mother, and Mina, a Christian girl who lived with my family and was as dear to me as my big sister, Betty. We were burying my childhood. The train would take us from our little town of Stockholm and Ring all the way to Bremen, about 320 kilometers, 200 miles away. Only once had I been so far away from home. A year earlier, my parents had borrowed our uncle's car, and we had taken Betty to the Bremen port to see her off when she left for America. Until then, I had never ridden from my bike further than the next town. From that trip with Betty, and from my geography class, I knew that Bremen was a large city, a port where huge ships came and went day and night. So I would board one of those ships and sail to America, all by myself. Chicago. I was going to Chicago, the city where Betty now lived with her new family. We had not studied that place in my geography class, but I knew from her address that Chicago was a state called Illinois. I didn't even know what a state was, but I knew Illinois was in the distant place called America, which my father sometimes called as Die Globetsland, the Promised Land. It felt like I was going to the moon. Show me your passport. My father's voice broke through my thoughts as I stared out the train's window. The wheels screeched, steam puffing up from the tracks. Without taking my gaze from the window, I held up the passport dangling from a string around my neck. We all jerked backward as the train began to move. The local church, our school, my house, drifted past us, each a perfect postcard. The train picked up speed. The pictures blurred. My father was still talking. Now, Tidy, your ticket is right here, too, he said, patting the breast pocket of his best wool coat. You remember, we're sending a telegram on Uncle Jacob, your uncle in America. The Jewish group organizing the trip will let him know when to meet you. In Chicago, yes. Tidy? Uncle Jacob? I'd never met Uncle Jacob. How would I know him when I saw him? I certainly couldn't ask anyone, since I couldn't speak English. And Uncle Jacob, who went to America nearly 30 years ago, will he still speak German? I knew only one story about this uncle, my father's eldest brother, who had immigrated in 1910. My father had told me that Jacob enlisted in the ambulance corps, not the infantry, in the United States Army. He feared that if he served in the infantry, he might find himself pointing a gun at the head of one of his two brothers serving on the German side. His youngest brother, my father, Sigmund, was proud to have served the fatherland in the Great War, and proud of the medal he'd won, the famous Iron Cross, trimmed in white, with the year 1914 ravaged on its face. Captured by the Russians and held as a prisoner of war, he learned to speak Russian. That made him fluent in 5 languages. My father believed absolutely in Germany, and so he was stunned by the anti-Semitism that swept the country in the 1930s. I can't believe my comrades would turn against me, he muttered, as he figured the Iron Cross that was displayed on the bookshelf in our living room. His ancestors, my ancestors, had been among the town's greatest settlers. The old records showed that the Westerfields had lived in Stockholm long before Germany was Germany, for more than 200 years. My parents told me that we were descended from refugees who had fled the Spanish Inquisition and settled, a few families here, a few families there, in towns and cities of northern Europe. Only one other Jewish family, my mother's ancestors, came to Stockstedt. Their distance, my mother's cousin, had flown to America a few years ago. When things started to get bad for Jews, after my parents sent my sister away, only 4 Jews, my mother, my father, my grandmother, mother, and I were left in a town of 2,000 people. I'd often hear my parents talk about how Hitler urged towns to make themselves free of Jews. Now, a large spin in front of the village hall caught my eye as the train sped past a town. That town had met its goal, but not in our time. There would still be 3. Why hadn't we all left together? Months, then years, had slipped away as my parents tried to decide what we should do. My mother wanted the whole family to emigrate together, but my father couldn't persuade his mother, who lived with us, to leave. In 1721, the Westerfields had built our home. A large German toddler had held us together with straw and manure, and carefully maintained and handed down from one generation to the next. My father's mother, Oma Sarah, often reminded us that this was her home. She had always lived within these walls, this town, this country. I was born in Germany. She would tell my father whenever he pressed her to leave, I would die a German. My father wouldn't go without his mother. For the longest time, he thought that things eventually would change in Germany. And he'd say things really weren't too bad, as long as the laws weren't too restrictive, as long as he could bring in money by buying and selling local produce, as long as he could believe that Hitler wouldn't last. He could say, Die Vergangenheit durch, he'd say, the year 34 is going away, but 35 is coming. In German, it was a spun that suggested the Führer, Hitler, would be gone. I will continue this in my next video. Thank you for listening to this book. You can buy this book at Barnes & Noble. That is where I got it. And this book was based on true events.